Sometimes the people who walk away from you are only making room for the person who was always meant to find you. The international terminal had almost emptied by the time the final departure board switched from bright blue to the soft overnight display. Cleaning crews quietly pushed their carts across the polished floors while the distant sound of rolling suitcases echoed beneath the high glass ceiling. Yasmin Carter sat alone on a metal bench near the nearly deserted departure gates, holding a small backpack against her chest as she stared at the message glowing on her phone. Only 15 minutes earlier, her boyfriend had sent a short text telling her not to wait for him anymore. He had boarded another flight after an argument, leaving her stranded hundreds of miles from home with almost no money, no transportation, and no clear plan for the night. Yasmin slowly locked her phone and took a deep breath. She had learned long ago that life rarely became easier simply because someone wished it would. Growing up, her mother had always reminded her that dignity was something no one could take unless she willingly surrendered it. So instead of crying or asking strangers for sympathy, Jasmine quietly stood, walked toward a nearby information desk, and politely asked whether there were any affordable buses still operating after midnight. The airport employee apologized with genuine regret. Every bus had already departed, nearby hotels were nearly full because of weather delays, and ride-share prices had increased dramatically due to demand. Yasmin thanked the employee anyway before stepping back into the quiet terminal. Across the spacious concourse, Ethan Brooks walked alone after finishing a private meeting with several senior executives. At 41 years old, the white Korean mafia boss had built an extraordinary reputation through discipline, discretion, and relentless work. Very few people knew he secretly owned the airline operating from the terminal because Ethan preferred remaining invisible whenever possible. He believed titles often prevented honest conversations. Dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal business suit beneath a dark overcoat, he moved through the nearly empty airport with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to carrying enormous responsibility without seeking attention. As he approached the terminal exit, a quiet exchange near the information desk caught his attention. He noticed Jasmine thanking the employee even after receiving disappointing news. There was no anger in her voice, no complaint, only quiet gratitude. Curious, Ethan paused without making his presence obvious. He watched as Jasmine searched through her wallet, counted a few folded bills, smiled gently to herself as though encouraging her own courage, and calmly walked toward the public seating area. She sat beneath a large window overlooking the runway where the final aircraft of the evening slowly taxied beneath rows of glowing lights. Ethan found himself unexpectedly unable to continue walking. He had spent years surrounded by people asking for favors, opportunities, or financial support, yet this young woman accepted disappointment with remarkable grace while asking nothing from anyone. After several thoughtful moments, he walked toward the same seating area and stopped a respectful distance away. Jasmine looked up with polite curiosity as the unfamiliar man offered a calm smile. "Excuse me," Ethan said gently. "I could not help noticing you may need a safe ride home tonight. If you are comfortable accepting the offer, I would be happy to help." Yasmin studied his expression carefully. He appeared composed rather than persuasive, respectful rather than intrusive. She had every reason to be cautious, yet something about his quiet sincerity felt unexpectedly reassuring. Outside the towering glass walls, another airplane disappeared into the night sky while the airport lights reflected across the rain-soaked runway. Yasmin hesitated for one final moment before softly asking the question that would quietly change both of their lives forever. Why would a complete stranger want to help someone he has never even met before? For several quiet seconds Ethan simply looked through the tall glass windows toward the rain shimmering across the runway before answering Jasmine's question with a complete honesty. "Because once, a stranger helped my mother when she had nowhere else to go," he said calmly. "She told me that kindness only matters if it continues through someone else." Yasmin studied his face carefully. His voice carried no trace of rehearsed charm or hidden expectation. It sounded like someone remembering a lesson that had stayed with him for many years. She lowered her eyes for a moment before offering a small grateful smile. "Thank you," she replied softly. "I am just trying to make the safest decision." Ethan nodded immediately. "You should. If you are uncomfortable, I can arrange a licensed airport car service instead. He only wanted to make sure you were not left alone tonight. The simple response eased much of Jasmine's concern because he respected her choice rather than trying to persuade her. After another thoughtful pause, she agreed to accept the ride. Together they walked through the nearly empty terminal toward the parking structure while airport employees finished the last tasks of the evening. Outside, a gentle rain continued falling beneath rows of bright lights reflecting across the wet pavement. Ethan opened the passenger door of a dark luxury sedan but never attempted to hurry the conversation. Once Jasmine settled inside, he quietly placed her backpack on the rear seat before taking his place behind the wheel. The warm interior remained peaceful as soft instrumental music played quietly through the speakers. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The city lights gradually replaced the airport as the vehicle entered the highway leading toward downtown Chicago. Yasmin eventually smiled politely. You never told me your name. Ethan glanced toward her briefly before returning his attention to the road. Ethan, he answered. Just Ethan. Yasmin introduced herself in return before thanking him again. She explained that she worked as a housekeeper at the Grand Meridian Hotel and had traveled to visit her mother for a few days before everything unexpectedly changed. She spoke without bitterness, never criticizing the boyfriend who had abandoned her. Instead, she simply accepted that some people made choices she could not control. Ethan listened quietly. He had spent years attending meetings where everyone seemed eager to speak about themselves, yet Jasmine talked mostly about the people she cared about. She described her mother's encouragement, her co-workers who felt like family, and the satisfaction she found in making guests feel welcome even when they never remembered her name. Ethan found himself asking questions he normally would never ask anyone. Do you ever wish your life had turned out differently? Yasmin looked through the rain-covered window at the passing skyline before answering. Of course. Everyone dreams sometimes. But I also believe happiness begins with appreciating the life already in front of us. Ethan considered her words carefully. They sounded remarkably simple, yet they challenged beliefs he had carried for years. His own life had been built around reaching the next goal, solving the next problem, protecting the next responsibility. He could not remember the last time he had simply appreciated an ordinary evening. As they crossed a bridge overlooking the Chicago River, Jasmine quietly pointed toward the glowing skyline. It always looks beautiful after rain, she said with genuine wonder. Ethan glanced toward the city and then toward Jasmine's peaceful expression. He realized he had driven this route hundreds of times without truly seeing it. When they finally arrived outside Jasmine's modest apartment building, Ethan parked along the curb and stepped out first despite the light rain. He walked her to the entrance beneath a small awning where warm lights glowed from the lobby windows. Yasmin turned toward him with sincere gratitude. Thank you for reminding me that good people still exist, she said softly. Ethan smiled in a way that surprised even himself. Thank you for reminding me that kindness does not need a reason. Yasmin waved before disappearing through the apartment doors. Ethan remained standing for another quiet moment, watching the lighted entrance long after she was gone, wondering why saying goodbye to someone he had only just met felt unexpectedly difficult. The following morning arrived wrapped in brilliant sunshine, washing away the rain that had covered the city only hours earlier. Yasmin woke before sunrise, just as she always did, preparing for another day at the Grand Meridian Hotel. Although the disappointment of the previous evening still lingered somewhere in her heart, she refused to let it define her future. She carefully folded the clothes she had worn during her unexpected trip, brewed a simple cup of coffee, and quietly thanked God for giving her another day to begin again. Before leaving her apartment, she paused for a moment beside a framed photograph of her mother, smiling gently as she remembered the words that had guided her since childhood. Never allow another person's decision to determine your worth. Those words stayed with her as she walked through the busy streets of downtown Chicago toward the hotel. At almost the same time, Ethan Brooks sat alone inside the executive conference room at the headquarters of his airline. Around the polished table, senior executives presented reports about new routes, passenger satisfaction, and expansion plans. Large digital screens displayed financial projections while assistants distributed neatly organized documents. Ethan listened attentively as he always had, offering thoughtful observations and clear decisions whenever necessary. Yet despite the importance of the meeting, his thoughts unexpectedly drifted back to the quiet conversation inside his car the previous night. He remembered the way Jasmine had spoken about appreciating ordinary moments, the gratitude she expressed even after being abandoned, and the peaceful smile she carried despite having every reason to feel discouraged. It was unlike anyone he had met in many years. After the meeting concluded, the communications director invited Ethan to attend a scheduled press conference announcing several new company initiatives. As cameras flashed across the elegant stage, Ethan answered questions with calm professionalism while reporters eagerly documented every statement made by the mysterious owner of one of the nation's fastest-growing airlines. Across the city, televisions inside the employee lounge at the Grand Meridian Hotel quietly broadcast the same live event while staff members enjoyed their lunch break. Yasmin entered the room carrying a simple meal prepared from home, intending to eat before returning to her afternoon shift. She barely glanced toward the television until a coworker suddenly spoke with surprise. "That is the owner of Skybridge Airlines," one employee remarked while pointing toward the screen. Yasmin looked up absent-mindedly, then immediately froze. Standing confidently before dozens of reporters was the same quiet man who had driven her home the previous night. The same gentle smile. The same calm eyes. The same charcoal suit. Her heartbeat quickened as the news anchor introduced Ethan Brooks, praising his leadership and describing him as the private owner whose airline had become one of the industry's greatest success stories. Yasmin could hardly believe what she was hearing. Throughout their entire conversation, Ethan had never mentioned his wealth, his influence, or the remarkable company he had built. He had simply introduced himself as Ethan. Nothing more. She lowered her eyes toward her untouched lunch, quietly replaying every word they had shared. Suddenly his humility made even greater sense. He had chosen kindness without expecting recognition, generosity without revealing his status, and respect without allowing power to shape the conversation. Back inside his office after the press conference ended, Ethan dismissed the remaining appointments for the afternoon and stood alone beside the large window overlooking the city skyline. For reasons he could not explain, every success being celebrated that day felt strangely incomplete. His thoughts returned once again to the young woman who had thanked him for reminding her that good people still existed. Looking across the endless buildings stretching toward the horizon, Ethan quietly realized there was only one place he truly wanted to visit before the day came to an end, and for the first time in years, it had nothing to do with the business. Jasmine tried to return her attention to work, but the image of Ethan standing before dozens of reporters refused to leave her thoughts. Every room she cleaned that afternoon seemed quieter than usual, every polished window reflected the same question lingering in her mind. Why had a man with so much influence chosen to introduce himself as nothing more than Ethan? She replayed their conversation again and again, searching for even the smallest hint that he had expected admiration or gratitude because of his success. There had been none. He had listened far more than he had spoken, asked thoughtful questions instead of offering impressive stories, and treated her with the same respect he would have shown anyone else. That realization somehow mattered even more than the news itself. Meanwhile, Ethan sat alone inside his office after dismissing the final meeting of the day. The city stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, yet his attention remained fixed on a single decision. For years he had carefully separated his personal life from his business empire, rarely allowing emotion to influence his carefully planned routine. Yet every logical reason to remain where he was felt strangely unimportant compared to the quiet desire to see Jasmine once more. He picked up his coat, declined the offer of a security escort, and drove himself through downtown Chicago until the familiar entrance of the Grand Meridian Hotel appeared ahead. Inside the hotel lobby, guests checked in beneath sparkling crystal chandeliers while soft piano music filled the elegant space. Employees moved efficiently between reception desks, elevators, and marble hallways, maintaining the polished atmosphere expected from one of the city's finest hotels. When Ethan stepped through the revolving doors, several managers immediately recognized him from recent business events and instinctively prepared to greet an important corporate guest. Ethan acknowledged them politely before asking one simple question. "Is Jasmine Carter working this afternoon?" The managers exchanged surprised glances before one quietly contacted housekeeping. Several minutes later, Jasmine entered the lobby wearing her neatly pressed housekeeping uniform, her natural curls carefully arranged, her expression calm despite the surprise of being summoned downstairs. The moment their eyes met, the busy lobby seemed to fade into the background. Ethan offered the same warm smile she remembered from the previous evening, while Jasmine found herself smiling in return before either of them spoke. "I suppose I should apologize," Ethan said gently. "You learned who I was from the television instead of from me." Yasmin shook her head softly. "You never pretended to be someone else. You simply never mentioned everything else." Ethan appreciated the answer more than she realized. "I stopped introducing myself with titles a long time ago," he admitted. "People often begin speaking differently the moment they hear them." Yasmin looked at him with a quiet understanding. "Then I am glad I met Ethan before I met the owner of an airline." A gentle silence settled between them, comfortable rather than awkward. Nearby employees discreetly continued their work, pretending not to notice the unexpected conversation unfolding only a few feet away. Ethan finally reached into a nearby cafe counter and returned carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee. He handed one to Jasmine exactly the way she had mentioned she preferred it during their drive the night before, with a little cream and 1 packet of sugar. Yasmin accepted the cup with genuine surprise, realizing he had remembered such a small detail after only one conversation. She looked at him with grateful eyes and quietly asked, "Did you really come all the way here just to bring me coffee?" Ethan smiled with complete honesty before answering, "No, I came because I realized yesterday ended much sooner than I wanted it to, and I hoped you might allow us the chance to continue the conversation we never really finished." Jasmine accepted the coffee with a grateful smile, but what surprised her most was not the drink itself. It was the fact that Ethan had remembered a small detail from a conversation that most people would have forgotten moments later. In her world, kindness often appeared through simple actions rather than expensive gifts, and somehow that made his gesture feel even more meaningful. They moved away from the busy hotel lobby and sat near a quiet corner beside the large windows overlooking the city streets below. Outside, Chicago continued its endless rhythm of taxis, pedestrians, and glowing buildings, but inside their small space, the conversation felt peaceful and private. Ethan asked about her work at the hotel, and Jasmine explained how she had started there years earlier with little experience but slowly built a reputation through patience and dedication. She described the satisfaction she felt when guests returned and remembered her kindness, even if they never knew her full story. Ethan listened carefully, noticing how differently she viewed success. To him, success had always been measured by growth numbers, business achievements, and the ability to solve impossible problems. To Yasmin, success was knowing that someone had a better day because of something she did. The contrast fascinated him. "You make ordinary things sound important," Ethan said quietly. Yasmin smiled. "Maybe they were always important. Maybe people just stopped noticing." That answer stayed with him. Ethan had spent years surrounded by expensive offices, luxury vehicles, and influential people, yet he could not remember the last time someone had reminded him to appreciate simple moments. As they continued talking, Jasmine eventually asked about his life. Ethan paused before answering because most people usually wanted to know about his company, his wealth, or his reputation. Few ever asked about the person behind those things. "My life is complicated," he admitted. "I built something successful, but I also spent many years believing that being needed was the same as being understood." Yasmin looked at him with a quiet compassion. She did not try to fix his problems or offer easy advice. She simply listened, the same way she had listened when he offered help at the airport. That simple acceptance felt unfamiliar to Ethan. The afternoon passed faster than either of them expected. Employees changed shifts, guests entered and exited the hotel, and the sunlight slowly moved across the marble floor. Yet neither of them seemed eager to end the conversation. Before leaving, Ethan stood and thanked Jasmine for giving him her time. She laughed softly. You are thanking me for a conversation? Ethan nodded. Yes. Because it has been a long time since a conversation felt dishonest. Yasmin looked at him for a moment before saying, maybe honesty feels rare because people are often afraid to show who they really are. Ethan considered those words as he walked toward the hotel entrance. For someone who controlled an entire airline and made decisions affecting thousands of people, he found himself unexpectedly affected by the opinion of one woman who owned nothing more than her kindness and her courage. Later that evening, Jasmine returned to her apartment and found herself smiling while preparing dinner. She still did not fully understand why meeting Ethan felt different, but she knew one thing clearly. The man she met at the airport was not the powerful executive everyone recognized on television. He was simply a person who noticed when someone needed help and chose to offer it across the city. Ethan stood beside his office window watching airplanes race into the night sky. For the first time in years, he was not thinking about schedules, profits, or business strategies. He was thinking about a conversation, a smile, and a woman who reminded him that the most valuable things in life were often the ones no one could purchase. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm neither Ethan nor Jasmine had expected. They did not rush to define what was growing between them, and neither tried to force the next conversation. Instead, they allowed trust to develop naturally through small moments that slowly became the brightest part of each day. Sometimes Ethan stopped by the hotel after work with 2 cups of coffee. Other evenings they met at a neighborhood cafe where no one recognized him and no one looked twice at the successful businessman sitting across from a hotel housekeeper. Jasmine appreciated that he never tried to impress her with expensive restaurants or extravagant gifts. He seemed happiest when they could simply walk through the city without being interrupted. One Saturday afternoon Ethan suggested visiting a quiet public garden overlooking Lake Michigan. The spring air carried the scent of blooming flowers while families pushed strollers along winding paths and children laughed as they chased birds across the green lawns. Yasmin admired the peaceful atmosphere. It feels nice to be somewhere that reminds people to slow down, she said. Ethan smiled. I used to believe slowing down meant falling behind. I am beginning to think I had that backward. They found a wooden bench facing the water where sailboats drifted across the calm blue lake beneath a cloudless sky. For several comfortable minutes they simply watched the waves without speaking. Ethan eventually admitted something he had never shared with anyone outside his closest advisors. Most people assume my life is exciting because of my position, he said quietly. The truth is that success can become surprisingly lonely when everyone approaches you because of what you own instead of who you are. Yasmin turned toward him with gentle understanding. Then maybe you needed someone who met Ethan before she met everything else. Ethan laughed softly, realizing how perfectly she had described their beginning. He looked across the water before asking, "Does it bother you now that you know who I am?" Yasmin answered without hesitation. No. Because the first person I met was the man who stayed behind to help a stranger at the airport. Nothing I learned afterward changed that memory. Her words settled deeply within him. For years Ethan had measured himself through responsibilities, achievements, and expectations. Yasmin measured him by a single decision to be kind when no one was watching. That difference changed something inside him. As the afternoon faded into evening, they stopped at a small family-owned bakery where Jasmine insisted they share 2 slices of homemade pie instead of visiting an expensive restaurant. Ethan agreed with genuine enthusiasm, surprising even himself. The owner greeted regular customers by name, the smell of fresh bread filled the cozy dining room, and quiet conversations echoed warmly through the space. Ethan realized he felt more relaxed there than he had inside countless luxury establishments. When he drove Jasmine home later that evening, neither wanted the day to end. They remained beside the apartment entrance talking beneath the soft glow of the streetlights until Yasmin noticed the time and laughed. I think we have been saying goodbye for almost 20 minutes. Ethan smiled. Maybe that is because neither of us is actually ready to leave. Yasmin looked at him with the same peaceful expression that had first caught his attention at the airport. Then perhaps next time we should simply say goodnight and make plans for tomorrow. Ethan nodded, knowing tomorrow suddenly felt more meaningful than any business schedule waiting on his desk, because for the first time in many years, there was someone he genuinely looked forward to seeing again. Weeks passed, and the connection between Ethan and Jasmine continued growing through moments that felt ordinary to everyone else but meaningful to them. Neither of them rushed to define their relationship because both understood that trust was built through consistency, not promises made too quickly. Ethan, a man who had spent most of his life surrounded by business negotiations and carefully planned decisions, found himself looking forward to the simplest parts of his week. A morning coffee. A walk through the city. A conversation that had no purpose except enjoying the presence of another person. Yasmin noticed the change in him before he noticed it himself. The man who once appeared distant and unreachable had become someone who smiled more often, listened more carefully, and allowed himself to experience moments without immediately searching for the next responsibility waiting ahead. One evening, Ethan invited Jasmine to visit the airline headquarters after she finished her shift. He wanted to show her the place that had occupied most of his life, not as the owner introducing his success, but as Ethan sharing a part of himself. When Jasmine entered the modern building, she looked around with genuine curiosity. Employees greeted Ethan respectfully, but she noticed something important. He treated every person the same way, from executives wearing expensive suits to employees working behind the scenes. He remembered names, asked about families, and thanked people for their efforts. Yasmin smiled quietly as she watched him. "You know," she said, "you are different from what people expect." Ethan looked surprised. "What do they expect?" Yasmin thought for a moment before answering. "They probably expect someone powerful to always want to be the most important person in the room. But you seem more interested in making sure everyone else feels valued." That observation stayed with him because it revealed something he had never considered. Perhaps the person he wanted to become was not someone more powerful, but someone more connected. Later that night, they sat together in the private observation area overlooking the airport runway. Hundreds of lights stretched across the darkness as airplanes moved quietly through the sky. For Ethan, this place represented years of ambition, sacrifice, and responsibility. For Yasmin, it represented the beginning of a journey she never expected to take. "Do you ever regret helping me that night?" Yasmin asked softly. Ethan looked toward the runway before answering. "No, I think that was the first decision I made in a long time without thinking about consequences." Yasmin smiled. "Then maybe it was the most honest decision you made." Ethan nodded slowly. He realized she was right. His entire life had been built around careful strategies, but the moment that changed him came from a simple act of compassion. Before leaving, Jasmine noticed an old photograph displayed on Ethan's desk. It showed him years earlier standing beside his parents during the early days of his career. She asked about it, and Ethan shared stories he rarely told anyone. He spoke about his family's expectations, the pressure to succeed, and the loneliness that came from always trying to appear strong. Jasmine listened quietly, offering the same patience that had first made him feel understood. When she finally left the building that evening, Ethan stood near the window watching her disappear into the city lights below. He no longer felt like someone protecting a carefully built life. He felt like someone finally beginning to live one. And somewhere between the airport terminal where they first met and the quiet moments they now shared, Ethan realized the greatest change in his life had not come from owning an airline. It had come from meeting someone who never cared about what he owned, only who he truly was. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the trees along Chicago's streets with shades of gold and deep crimson while bringing a cool breeze that seemed to slow the city just enough for people to notice the beauty surrounding them. By then, spending time together had become a natural part of Ethan and Jasmine's lives. They no longer needed elaborate plans because even the simplest afternoon felt meaningful when they shared it. One Saturday evening, Ethan invited Jasmine to the rooftop observation deck overlooking the airport. From there, the city lights stretched toward the horizon while aircraft lifted gracefully into the darkening sky one after another, their navigation lights glowing like distant stars. The view had always reminded Ethan of responsibility, ambition, and countless decisions that shaped thousands of journeys every day. This time, however, he saw something entirely different. He saw the place where one unexpected decision had changed his own life. They stood side by side in comfortable silence as another airplane climbed steadily into the evening sky. Yasmin smiled gently. It is amazing how every flight carries people toward completely different futures. Ethan nodded slowly. I used to think I understood where every journey was supposed to end. Then life reminded me that the most important destinations cannot be scheduled. Yasmin looked at him with a quiet curiosity, sensing there was something deeper behind his words. Ethan rested his hands lightly against the railing before speaking with a sincerity he had rarely allowed himself to show. There is something I have wanted to tell you for a long time. Yasmin waited patiently without interrupting. Before I met you, Ethan continued, my life was organized down to the smallest detail. Every meeting, every investment, every decision had a purpose. I convinced myself that if I stayed focused enough, I would never need anyone. Depending on another person felt like weakness. I paused briefly while watching another aircraft disappear into the clouds. Then one evening I met a woman sitting alone at an airport who thanked an employee for disappointing news instead of becoming angry. She accepted kindness without expecting more than kindness. She reminded me that strength is not measured by how much control we have. It is measured by how much trust we are willing to give. Jasmine felt emotion quietly rising in her heart, yet she remained silent, allowing him to continue. Ethan turned toward her completely. I have met presidents, investors, celebrities, and people whose names appear in newspapers every day. Yet none of them changed me the way you have. You never cared about my position. You cared whether I was being honest. Somewhere between that airport and today, I realized something I never believed possible. I no longer measure my days by business success. I measure them by whether I will get to see you. Jasmine's eyes filled with a quiet warmth as she smiled through the cool evening air. She reached for Ethan's hand without hesitation. The man I met that night was already enough, she said softly. Everything else was only information. Ethan smiled with genuine relief, a rare expression that reached his eyes completely. I cannot promise a perfect future, he admitted. My responsibilities will always be complicated. But I can promise that I will never allow those responsibilities to become more important than the people I choose to love. Yasmin gently squeezed his hand. That is the only promise I ever hoped to hear. Together they remained beneath the endless evening sky while another airplane disappeared into the distance, neither of them realizing that the journey beginning with a quiet act of kindness had slowly become the place where both of their hearts had finally found their way home. Several months passed, and the world continued moving forward around Ethan and Jasmine, but their lives had changed in ways neither of them could have imagined on that quiet night at the airport. The Grand Meridian Hotel remained busy with guests arriving from across the country, while Ethan's airline continued expanding into new destinations. Yet despite their different worlds, they had created something that felt stronger than the distance between them. They had built a place where both could be completely honest. On a peaceful spring morning, Ethan returned to the airport where their story first began. The terminal looked different now, filled with travelers rushing toward new adventures, families saying goodbye, and friends welcoming each other home. But for Ethan, every corner carried a memory. He remembered seeing Jasmine sitting alone near the departure gates, not because she wanted sympathy, but because she refused to let disappointment take away her dignity. Yasmin joined him near the large windows overlooking the runway. She looked across the airport with a gentle smile. It feels strange being back here, she said. Everything looks the same, but everything feels different. Ethan nodded. That night changed more than I realized. Together they watched airplanes prepare for departure while sunlight reflected across the polished floor. Ethan no longer saw the airport as simply a place where people arrived and left. He saw it as the place where he learned that the most meaningful moments in life are often the ones no one plans. As they walked through the terminal, employees greeted Ethan respectfully, but he no longer cared about the attention that came with his position. His focus remained on Jasmine walking beside him. She had never been impressed by his company, his wealth, or his influence. She had been impressed only by the choice he made when nobody was watching. Later that afternoon, they visited a small community center where Jasmine volunteered several times each month. Ethan watched as she greeted families, helped organize supplies, and encouraged people who were facing difficult seasons in their lives. He understood then that her kindness was not something she displayed for recognition. It was simply who she was. You know, Ethan said as they walked outside afterward, I used to think changing the world required making the biggest decisions in the room. Yasmin smiled. Sometimes it begins with one small decision that changes one person's day. Ethan looked at her and realized that one small decision had changed his entire life. The man who once believed control was the foundation of strength had discovered that trust required even greater courage. The man who owned an airline had learned that the most valuable journey was not measured by miles traveled, but by the person waiting beside him when the journey ended. As evening approached, they stood together outside the airport watching the final flights of the day race into the sky. Ethan gently held Jasmine's hand while city lights began appearing across the horizon. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had walked past you that night? He asked. Yasmin looked toward the glowing runway before answering. Maybe we would have continued living separate lives. But I believe some moments are too important to ignore. Ethan smiled because he knew she was right. Their story had never been about wealth, status, or coincidence alone. It was about two people from completely different worlds who discovered that kindness could build a bridge where distance once existed. And as another airplane disappeared into the evening sky, Ethan finally understood something he had spent years searching for. Home was never a place he could own. It was a person who made him feel understood, accepted, and truly seen. That night at the airport, a stranger offered a simple kindness. Months later, that kindness had become the greatest journey of both their lives.